Good morning, friends. Welcome back to the Monday Study Group on this first Monday in the season of Lent. We have Acts 27, the famous narrative of the shipwreck, Paul's participation in that shipwreck in Acts chapter 27 to do today. There's not much in that chapter except the narration, is there, of the shipwreck. No speeches, a couple other things we'll call attention to, but first I wanted to let you know that we will be doing Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, next in the study. So that means that next Tuesday we will finish, I believe, Acts chapter 28 and conclude our study of the book of Acts. At which point you are certainly welcome, as you are anytime, to drop the Monday study group and not get emails from me on Monday and Tuesday and a video in one of those emails. So if you would like to do that, let me know. I don't want you to get emails from me that you don't want, that you just have to delete and they show up every week. So just let me know, and I will drop you off the mailing list for the Monday study group for now. And if you want to get back on later, after we do Acts, we're going to be doing, after we are doing Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, we will be doing two documents from early Christianity, the Didache and the letters of Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. And then after that, possibly Hebrews, but we'll be looking into that further down the road. It will take us a few weeks to do Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. I'm guessing 8 weeks, but that's just purely a guess. We may do more than one chapter at a time. Could be 10 weeks. And then after that, we will do the letters of Ignatius and the Didache, the two documents from late 1st, early 2nd century, to see what early Christians were thinking and believing, and what concerns they had as they were attempting to follow Christ in the 2nd century. So that's the news from the Monday study group's vote this morning. Hebrews came in third in the vote, and at some point we would like to do Luke Timothy Johnson's book, The Creed, which we recommended and which there was interest in, and also Carmen Acevedo Butcher's translation of The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. Those were also on the list. And it's a wonderful book, and I know we would greatly profit from reading that and talking about it together. So at some point later, maybe we'll do that. But that's what's ahead for the Monday study group. So if you want to continue, you don't have to do anything. You'll just still get the emails and the videos, and you can continue to study whatever we're studying here in the face-to-face meeting at the Pacific Rim Institute on Monday mornings. And I'll come home and make a video based on the discussion, and we'll go from there. So let's begin with prayer. We simply pray, Lord, that you will teach us the meaning of your word and how it applies to our lives today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, this narrative of the shipwreck that begins in Acts 27. How did we get here? Well, we got here because Paul, who had been on trial before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, who had been on trial before Felix, the governor in Caesarea, who was replaced by Festus, who also wanted to hear the case that was being made by Paul's opponents from Jerusalem against Paul. Paul got an opportunity to defend himself before Festus, and at the end of that, it seemed as if Festus was going to please Paul's opponents by sending Paul back to Jerusalem to be tried. And we know there was a plot against Paul's life to kill him before that ever happened. So Festus, the governor in Caesarea, the Roman governor, asked King Agrippa, who was visiting him, to hear Paul out and to give advice on what he should write to the emperor to accompany Paul, so that the emperor would have some clue about what Paul's situation was and why he was being sent to Rome for the final adjudication of the case against Paul. They've already admitted, almost everybody, every Roman official who has heard Paul and heard his opponents, have already said that he didn't deserve either imprisonment or death. He'd done nothing against Roman law. And if he hadn't appealed to the emperor, he could have been set free. But once he did appeal, then he needed to be sent to Rome. And that's where chapter 27 begins. Chapter 27 says that Paul and other prisoners were put on a ship that would sail along the coast of Asia Minor. And if, again, you really need to use your map, don't you? Your Bible map at the back of your Bible. Almost every Bible has Bible maps at the back. So this is one of those chapters when you kind of have to follow along on the Bible map. So Paul and other prisoners were transferred to a centurion by the name of Julius, and that centurion found a ship that was going to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. That is the Roman provinces of Asia, north of the island of Cyprus and along that coast of modern-day Turkey, the southern coast of Turkey. There was a man by the name of Aristarchus, whom we saw in chapter 19 of Acts as one of the people who was a companion of Paul's and was dragged into the arena in Ephesus while people were shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And it was during a riot that these followers of Paul were arrested because they were Christians, and they did not think Artemis of the Ephesians was a god or goddess. So this friend of Paul's named Aristarchus apparently is going to accompany him all the way to Rome. We don't hear about him again in the narrative, but he accompanied Paul, and so apparently did Luke. We'll run into passages that have the pronoun we in them, we and us, and indicating that Luke himself was likely present with Paul on this journey. And so they sailed from Caesarea north to Sidon, another coastal city in Israel. And from there, Paul, while they were in port there, Paul was allowed to visit his friends, or possibly his friends came to visit him. You could read the text either way. But Paul, the NRSV says, was allowed to go to his friends and be cared for, and I think provisioned for the trip, given food and other things that he might need for support as he was going to be sailing to Rome, a long, long journey from Israel. So they put out to sea from Sidon, and here you need to be looking at the map at some point, and it was sailed north of the island of Cyprus. The wind is coming down from Asia Minor, from Turkey, coming down from the north and providing sailing between Cyprus and the land of Asia Minor would provide protection against the wind. They could sail in the lee of the island and of the landmass and have the least possible threat to their voyage. Nevertheless, it was difficult. It says the winds were against us. And if you look at your map, they're going to be sailing north of Cyprus, south of the Asian provinces of Cilicia and Pamphylia, and then they finally come to port, a stop at Myra in the province of Lycia. That takes us to verse 5. And that's as far as that ship was going to go. So they had to find another ship. They didn't, of course, the centurion did. The centurion found another ship that was bound for Italy, a ship that ultimately had come from Alexandria and was sailing and had already sailed up to Asia Minor across the Mediterranean and was now going to go further west and south around the boot of Italy and to a port near Rome. So they transferred all the prisoners to that ship, and Luke says that he put us on board. Again, now Luke is narrating this in the first person plural. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off the coast of Cnidus. It doesn't say they spent time in the port of Cnidus. It reads as if they were sailing continuously. Now, if you found Cnidus on your map, it's still very close to Asia Minor, to the north landmass. But they're going to turn suddenly south and sail under the island of Crete to get protection from the wind and possibly to have a port to winter in Crete. So it says that as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Salmone is on the far eastern edge of Crete on the Bible map. So they're coming down from the north, from near Asia Minor and islands off the coast of Asia Minor, sailing due south and eventually under Crete at the point of the port of Salmone. Sailing past that area with difficulty, again because of the wind against them, they came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Modern scholars know where Lasea is. Fair Havens itself has never been discovered or unearthed, but it was a port about 5 miles apparently south of Lasea. Not an ideal place, a small village, Lasea. Hardly enough provisions there for 276 more people to spend the winter there. We don't know how many people were in the town or village of Lasea, but it was a small community. And whether 276 additional people would have been able to have sufficient provisions for the winter, whether there were other ships that had been caught in that port and were also needing to stay there and therefore to be provisioned from this small town is a consideration. That these considerations led them to think that this was not a good place to try to stay for the winter. But sailing conditions were getting worse and worse. Much time had been lost, and sailing was now dangerous, because even the fast of the Day of Atonement, which occurred in mid-October in the year Paul is sailing here, even the Day of Atonement had passed in mid-October, and the time when anyone could sail in the Mediterranean in the winter was fast approaching. But they thought Paul advised them that they should stay anyway, that danger is lurking with much loss to the cargo and ship, but also the threat that we would lose our lives in a shipwreck. And people did lose their lives in shipwrecks. We have records of people sailing in a ship with 600 people on board and only 80 surviving, contemporaneous with this account. So Paul warns them that they should not go on, but the centurion decided to pay more attention to the more experienced pilot of the ship and the owner of the ship. And the owner of the ship, of course, had a strong vested interest in getting his cargo to Italy so he could sell it. The centurion, who is apparently in charge of this voyage, along with the captain of the ship, decided that they would try to harbor for the winter at a different port, but still in Crete. They wanted to make for the port of Phoenix, which is on the far west end of the island and was a port more suitable for provisions and for the protection of the ship against the winds, the storms that would come during the winter time. So it says that since this harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach the port of Phoenix on the island of Crete, and it was a more favorable port given the way it faced. So it appeared, fortunately, the wind shifted, and now instead of the wind coming out of the north threatening the ship, the wind shifted from the south and would enable them to more easily sail along the southern coast of Crete and make that port of Phoenix in a few dozen miles, nautical miles. And so they set sea. They weigh anchor and sail along the coast of Crete, as close to the coast as they could manage. But soon a violent wind, a nor'easter, blew down from the mountains of Crete and out across the southern coast of Crete, driving the ship that Paul and the prisoners and the crew and the Roman soldiers were all on. And the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, which would enable them to get to Phoenix, the harbor on the western end of Crete. But they had to give way to the wind and were driven by it. And it says they ran under, now we're at verse 16, they ran under the lee of a small island called Cauda, and were scarcely able to get the lifeboat, which was being dragged behind the boat, scarcely able to get it under control and bring it into the boat. The "we" there is interesting because it implies that Luke may have been involved, and maybe some of the prisoners, like Paul, involved in dragging this lifeboat, which was nearly swamped with water, and it would have been very heavy for them to drag it into the ship and get it up into the ship, get it under control. But we did that. We were scarcely able to do it, but they did it. And after hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship, fearing that they would run on the Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. A couple things to say there. This undergirding was normally done ashore or in port or when a boat was beached. You would wrap it around vertically to hold the ship together against damage from storms. That normally was what undergirding meant. But now they're out in a storm in the open sea, so how will they accomplish undergirding? That term may now mean something more like girding around the boat, horizontally rather than vertically, holding the ship together with ropes tied strongly around the ship. How they would have done it the other way, holding the ship together with vertical ropes going under the keel and back up over the ship and under the keel and back and so forth, how that would have been accomplished in an open sea is very difficult to think. So perhaps undergird here means in general holding the ship together with ropes probably around it. And the Syrtis was the coast of North Africa, which is now the landmass to their south, but it's a couple hundred miles away at least from Crete. Yet the wind is blowing so strongly that these experienced sailors who knew about the reefs off the coast of North Africa did not want the ship to be blown that direction, which is the way the wind would have blown them. And so they tried to take provisions to protect the ship against running onto the reefs at Syrtis. But the storm continued to pound them violently, and they needed to run higher in the water to prevent the ship from being swamped. So they threw off the ship so it would be more buoyant, that it would have less weight pressing it down into the water. So they threw off the ship whatever they could, including eventually the ship's tackle on verse 19. And they've done everything they can do to make the ship light enough to keep from capsizing and losing the ship and it sinking and they drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. Furthermore, they could not navigate by the stars because it was so overcast that they could neither see the sun nor the stars at night, and so they did not really know where they were or in what direction they were moving. And Luke says, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned, having done everything they could to make the ship stable and floating higher in the water, to prevent it from being swamped by the heavy waves of the Mediterranean Sea in this violent storm from the northeast, driving them to the south and to the west. They had done everything they could do, couldn't even tell where they were or what direction they were moving in for sure, and so they lost all hope of being saved. They had also been without much food for a long time. So Paul stood up among them all and said, Men, yes, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and avoided all this damage and loss. Well, that sounds like I told you so. But I think Paul's motive here was to say, I know what I'm talking about. I'm an experienced traveler. I've been shipwrecked before, possibly 3 times, before. Paul says he was shipwrecked and spent a day and a night in the sea. He's had experience. He's not a landlubber who doesn't know what he's talking about. So maybe they'll listen to him now, and he's already proved that he had given good advice earlier that they didn't follow. So he says, I urge you to keep up your courage, because it is my belief that there will be no loss of life among us, but only the ship will be lost. And how do I know that? Well, you might not believe this, Paul said, but last night an angel of the God whom I serve and whom I worship said to me, don't be afraid, Paul. You are going to stand before the emperor in Italy. You'll get there. The ship may be lost, but your life won't be lost. And furthermore, God has granted as a favor the safety of all who are sailing with you. Not a single life will be lost. So Paul reported to everyone on board, all 276 people, that God had told him they all would not die in this storm. The ship would be lost, but they won't die. Probably some people didn't believe Paul, and others did believe Paul. So he urges them to keep up their courage, for he has trust in God that it will be just as he has told them. But we will have to run aground on some island. So that was the speech of encouragement Paul gave them. And on the 14th night, probably from Crete, though some people think from Cnidus up in Asia Minor, on the 14th night, as they were drifting across the sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings. Maybe they could hear waves crashing on the beach. Possibly they could hear birds that they hadn't heard before. But whatever it was, the sailors suspected they were nearing land, were afraid that they would crash on the shore or the rocks. And so they took soundings and found that they were getting closer and closer to some land, some island. They did not want to run on the rocks that were nearby on the island. This is verse 29. And so they let down 4 anchors from the stern to prevent the ship, if possible, from going even closer to the shore during the night. Much harder to know where you're headed if you crash into the rocks at night. And hoped that they could last until morning came. But in the meantime, some of the sailors got anxious about their survival and felt that it was going to be every man for himself. And so these sailors decided they were going to take the lifeboat and get off the ship and make it to shore on their own without the others. But when they tried to escape the ship on the pretext of putting anchors out from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless all these men stay on the ship, we won't be saved. You've got to stay on the ship. Well, this time they listened to Paul, and the soldiers cut the ropes to the boat and let it drift away over the side of the ship, so the sailors could not get away on their own. And as dawn was breaking, Paul urged all of them to take some food. They had not eaten for some time because of the violence of the sea, also because they were busy trying to save their lives, and so they had not eaten for a long time. Paul urges them to eat some food that they will need to strength for the strength to survive, and he says, none of us will lose our lives. Verse 34. And he, as an example to the rest, took some bread, broke it, ate it, gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And that encouraged enough of them that they also took food to eat and provisioned themselves for the ordeal that was to come. 276 people in the ship, Luke says. Some ancient authorities say 76, but the better attested reading is 276. We know that ancient ships could carry up to 500, 600 people. And after they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship as best they could. Why do you do that? You want the ship to ride even higher so that it can get as far to the beach as possible without crashing, making the swim or the floating to the shore as short as possible. Again, in the violence of the waves that are happening all around them. So in the morning, though they didn't recognize where they were, they saw a bay with a beach and decided to try to run the ship up on the shore there, if they could. So they cast off all the anchors, left them in the sea, loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars on the sides of the ship, set the foresail into the wind, and made for the beach. But they didn't make it. They struck a reef and ran the ship aground into the reef, and it remained immovable. They couldn't get it off the reef. The wind kept, and the waves kept blowing from the stern, and now the stern of the ship is being broken up by the force of the waves. It's beginning to collapse and sink into the sea. And at this point, the soldiers are worried that the prisoners will escape and that they'll be held responsible for the loss of the prisoners. And so their plan is to kill the prisoners, that they might not swim away and escape. But the centurion, apparently Julius, the same one that we've been reading about from the beginning of this chapter, Julius wants to save Paul. And so the centurion ordered them not to kill the prisoners, to trust what Paul had said, that they all would make it to shore safely. And so the centurion orders those who could swim to jump overboard first, and that may have included Paul, and make for the land, and that the rest would follow on boards of the ship that were breaking up from the stern and other pieces of the ship. And so it was that all of them did in fact get to land safely. Even at this point they did not know exactly where they were, but it turned out just the way Paul had said it would when he had been assured by an angel from God that they would all get to shore safely. Famous shipwreck story. One of the You can feel the intensity of the story as you read it. You enjoy the detail that Luke puts into it. He's an eyewitness. He's participating in this shipwreck, and it makes for a very exciting narrative as we draw to a close the book of Acts. We only have one chapter left, and we'll take that up next week. As I said earlier, I'll send you study questions for chapter 28 and also information about what we're going to do next in the study of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. I'll give you some advice on commentaries to use, and we'll get started on that in a couple of weeks. So again, thank you for participating in the Monday study group.